A Swift Kick in the Ass, episode 43.
Welcome to a Swift Kick in the Ass podcast, hosted by lifelong friends Tom Stewart and John Curren. Today's episode is a special feature covering Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power.
Welcome, I'm Tom Stewart, and I'm joined with my lifelong childhood friend, John Curren. And again, today, we have something very special. The 48 Laws of Power applied to The Walking Dead. Ooh, what do you think, John?
I'm so freaking scared right now.
It's what happens when you take a best-selling book with one of the most popular TV shows and mix them together. That's what this podcast is going to be about.
Yeah, you might, if you're anything like me, you might be afraid to walk your dog at night. After listening to this episode, you might want to keep your eyes a little bit more open and watch out. You know, we talk about how to learn how to not get played through the laws of power, and now we're combining it with The Walking Dead, and a apocalyptic world that's filled with zombies. That's pretty scary. And a lot of you are probably thinking, what the hell are these guys doing with this? But, The Walking Dead is so popular because people can relate to it. It's not just about zombies. It's about the humans that the characters interact with. It's about that world that is, just gone crazy and gone wild.
Now, let me specify, because it's possible we might have listeners that don't watch The Walking Dead. They don't have to tune out. Let's give the premise for what The Walking Dead is. The main character is Sheriff Rick Grimes, and Rick Grimes had been shot and was in a coma for 30 days. When he wakes up out of a coma, he finds out that the world has gone to crap and that the zombie apocalypse has happened. And, he doesn't know what they are. He doesn't know anything about where his family is, or where his friends and where everyone else is. Everyone seems to be dead, and the dead seem to be walking again and trying to eat him. So that's the premise for the show, but it really focuses on the survival part of it and how the main threat is not so much the zombies, it's the people that they run into, and how society degrades and becomes something a little bit more harsh, something more like the medieval times, right?
Yeah, and I mean, the zombies are absolutely threatening. I mean, anything that is coming after you that wants to eat you, to me, that's threatening. That's as threatening as you could get. But the zombies are predictable, and they're almost like pack animals or herd, cows, members of a herd.
Right.
So in that way, it is not, it isn't as scary, but scary nonetheless.
All right, so we're going to assume that, even if the people never watch this show, they might want to go back and watch the show before they listen to this episode. But for the fans, and I know there's a lot of them out there, we're going to jump right in, and we're going to start with law number 1, never outshine the master. And I think we see this very pertinent when we see after the governor has kind of had his fall and is walking around in a stupor, he eventually meets up with one of his henchmen, Martinez, and Martinez has climbed to the rank of being in charge of this other group of survivors. And the governor doesn't take too well to, playing, second fiddle.
Yeah, and, where Martinez really screws up is, it says here in the law, make your masters appear more brilliant than they are, and you will attain the heights of power. And Martinez ignored that law. He made himself to be perhaps even a better leader than the governor, and bad things happened to that character.
Right, and plus he was kind of he's kind of goading the governor, saying, there's no one can keep us safe, and the governor at that time had a love interest, right, and he also had his love interest had a little girl, so he was feeling his connections to a family that he had long ago, and he wanted to protect them. And he thought the only way that he can protect them is to stand up and be who he used to be, the governor. Because he tried being a nice guy and tried, running away. It just didn't work. So he ended up killing anyone that was in his way, and that happened to be Martinez. Hit him over the head with a golf club and then dragged him to a pit of walkers and threw him in.
Okay. Go. We got a lot of laws to cover, so we'll just touch upon these. And we might even go back and forth. We're not going to do them in order, right, Tom?
Right. So the next one that comes up, obviously law number 2, never put too much trust in friends. And this is a big premise, especially for the first season, and leading into the second, between Rick and Shane. Rick and Shane were friends, much like you and me. They were childhood friends, grew up together, went to high school together, and became police officers together. But when Rick was in a coma, Shane and
sleeping with his wife.
Right, Shane and his wife were playing hanky panky.
Friendship. Just
right.
Heads up on that, Tom.
Well, yeah. Well, so he, and basically, when the zombie apocalypse had happened, they just thought that Rick was gone. They thought that there's no way he could have survived at the hospital. The hospitals were some of the ones that the zombies appeared at first, because the sick people, when they died, would come back as zombies. So, almost everyone at the hospital had been killed or by the soldiers or eaten by zombies. So when they do reunite, he finds out that Shane's been kind of living with Lori and his son Carl as, like a makeshift family.
Yeah, just taking over. Now, when you read the law itself, I think it's worth reading at least the first line. It says, "Be wary of friends. They will betray you more quickly, for they are easily aroused to envy." And I think that's exactly what Shane was feeling. Shane was envious of Rick's life, and he kind of just saw that Rick was gone and decided, hey, I'm gonna fill those shoes.
Yeah, and absolutely. And when Rick came back, the envy really came on strong, because then Shane had to keep quiet about his relationship because, Rick didn't know, but he saw here's, the end of the world and his family's back together, and he's getting jealous. And he's like, man, all I have to do is, push them into a bunch of walkers, that's what they call zombies on the show. And, my problem will be gone. But it's also his friend. How's he going to knock off his friend? Is it worth, the relationship with Lori, Rick's wife?
Yeah, I said we weren't necessarily going to go in order, but I think law number 3, conceal your intentions, really feeds well into that.
Yeah.
Shane had to conceal his intentions. I mean, he had every intention, I think, of completely filling Rick's shoes. And
well, he tried. He tried at the end. He tried to kill Rick, but Rick was already kind of wise to it and turned the tables on him and, put him down. It's funny because in the comic book, it's a little bit different. Actually, Carl puts him down in the comic book, but the TV deviates a little bit. This is also a very popular comic book that was out before the show, but they follow the comic book, but they also deviate from it because they don't want people to know every exact twist and turn.
Yeah. So both Rick and Shane were concealing their intentions and, keeping people off balance and in the dark, by never revealing the purpose behind their actions. And
that also the governor follows that same law. When you first meet the governor, you're like, the guy doesn't seem too bad. I mean, he's keeping his people safe. You don't realize till later that he's, bat crap crazy, and he has a zombie daughter locked up and all these, heads of zombies floating in fish tanks. And he sits there and watches them like, he's watching the boob tube. So people don't realize how crazy this guy is, but his, he conceals what his true motivations are. And the same thing when they go to Terminus, which is the group of survivors that found that the only way that they can survive without starving was to eat their fellow humans, and Rick and his crew was going to be their next buffet. So, when they came in, they said, hey, you want to join our group? They didn't let them know they were cannibals. They're like, you got to take your guns off. Here's some food. We know you're hungry, make yourself comfortable, but we just have to, make sure that you're not here to harm us. So they, took all their weapons. And then once their guard was down, that's when they locked them up and said, hey, we're going to herd you like cattle and bring you to the slaughter and eat you.
It's funny. So I said we weren't going to go in line, but so Terminus, they concealed their intentions, definitely.
Right.
When they marketed Terminus and they put up all the signs, along the along every crossroad in that area, they were directing people to say, come here, be safe, and this is the place to be. But here Law 4 really comes into play. Always say less than necessary. They're not going to just come out and say, hey, you know what? Come on in because you're lunch.
Right. They can't. The other part of Law 4, which always say less than necessary, that I think of the episode called Nebraska, when Rick is inside the bar and Shane's already dead at this point, right? I think Shane's already gone. And these guys are trying to, they run into two more survivors, and one's named Fat Tony, right? And the guy is, obviously a not very couth person. He's peeing in the bar on the floor. And the other guy seems friendly, but you could tell these guys are bad news. They're just trying to find someone to take advantage of. So they're talking to Rick, and they keep on trying to press him. Hey, you guys, you look pretty healthy. You must have a camp around here. And Rick's like, no, we're on the road like you guys. And he goes, no, really, you have a farm? Is that it? And he kept on pressing, and Rick would always say less than necessary because he wouldn't, he didn't want to give up that they had a farm nearby, because he knew that these guys are part of a group probably larger than them that would power them, kill them, and take whatever they had. So, Rick, it turns out that he was right, because the guy drew down on him, and Rick, being the quick draw McGraw, killed both of the guys. And it was almost a turning point for Rick Grimes, where he was like, you know what? I got to kill. I got to, it's kill or be killed in this new world. And it's all about the survival.
Yep. Absolutely agree.
So law number 5, so much depends on reputation. Guard it with your life. When we meet Herschel, Herschel's a very upstanding guy. And when Herschel finally exits the series, he's the same way. He never changes. He keeps his reputation up as someone that's willing to help, someone that's honest, someone that's, a God-fearing man. He meets his end at the end of a samurai sword wielded by the governor. And to that end, he never tried to hurt people. He always tried to help, and he guarded his reputation. Whereas, same thing with the governor. I mean, the governor tried to, make sure that everyone basically feared him. He was almost the opposite of Herschel, but he also, too, guarded his reputation with his life. And anyone that questioned him would usually meet their demise in like a pit full of walkers.
I think, too, Rick applies this law as well. He's consistent in his decision making. But I have to wonder too that, so it's the zombie apocalypse. You're in survival mode. You're just trying to stay alive. Who the hell cares about your reputation? Guard it with your life. I mean, I'm guarding myself, guarding my own life.
Well, for the governor, it was important because he was the head of an entire community. So, if he was to slip, then, someone might take him off and then, not see him as the powerful figure that he was.
I guess, again, with the laws of power, we're talking about power, and whether you're dealing with the governor or Rick or anyone in leadership position, if you're trying to assert your power, Law 5 is just spot on. So much depends on reputation. You have to guard it with your life because you're always, as a leader, you're always open up to attack. You're vulnerable, and you don't want to expose those vulnerabilities, or you're going down. So always be alert to potential attacks and thwart them before they happen. That's the sign of a powerful leader.
All right, so skipping forward, let's jump to law number 7. Get others to do the work for you. Now, if you remember, the governor got this trick down where he crashed through the gates with, I think it was an armored car, and then out of the back, a bunch of zombies popped out, or walkers, as on this show, and it was a distraction. It was a way to make Rick and his crew that were heavily armed waste all their ammo on these walkers trying to defend themselves. And you also see the same tactic used in Fear the Walking Dead, which is a spin-off show, where Daniel Salazar, basically he unleashes this whole arena full of 2,000 walkers, and they're trying to break into an army secured medical facility that some of their crew was at. So the only way to do that is they had to distract the army. And so what they did is he unleashed all these walkers and, had them, the walkers follow very easily. So all he had to do is walk and they followed him, and he led them right to the gates and then, let the army try to take care of them. And we also see this with we'll save that one for something else coming up.
Yeah. I think this law is all about teamwork and delegation. When you're especially in survival mode, or if you're in if you're in power and you're leading a group of people, you can't do everything yourself. And a true leader will delegate responsibilities. Like they have the teams of people that go out and gather supplies. They have scouts to go ahead of the pack and take a look at what's going on, so they don't so that they know what's coming up in front of them. I think that's what wise leaders do, whether you're in the zombie apocalypse or you're in the real world. This law of power absolutely applies.
Law number 8, which is make other people come to you, use bait if necessary. There's a couple things that apply to this, but since I just almost mentioned it because it's very similar, is when Merle was trying to find redemption, remember he was supposed to hand over Michonne to the governor in exchange for, the governor would say, hey, you bring me her and I'll leave you guys alone. I won't try to invade the prison. You guys can live your life. We'll live our life. And Merle, finally doing the right thing in his life, let Michonne go because he was on his way taking her to the governor, and he decided he was going to bring a horde of zombies with him. So he drove real slowly and, had some loud rock music playing, and the zombies followed him along right to the meeting point with the governor. And he basically used himself as bait in order to, take out a lot of the governor's men in order to give his brother and Rick's group, a fighting chance.
Yeah. We might as well just keep on going down the line.
Well, hold on. We still got more. Okay. We have another example for that one also. Quite literally, Glenn used himself as walker bait. Remember, they put him they put a lasso on him and lowered him down inside of the well on the farm. And they were trying to get the well zombie. There was a zombie had fallen down in their fresh water supply. And they were like, if we kill the zombie inside the water supply, its guts and everything are going to explode and our water is going to be ruined. So let's, put Glenn out there on a rope, have the thing go after him, then Glenn will lasso it, and they'll pull the walker out of the well, and then they'll kill it once they get it up above.
So do you think they split tested that zombie water?
Yeah, who would be the first person to take that? Because you think he's still in there, rotting for, a month or two. So I don't think I'd drink that water.
I think at that point too, they didn't realize maybe that they had that disease, regardless of whether or not they were alive or dead. Okay. Law number 9, win through your actions, never through argument. I think especially in The Walking Dead, they seem to, pull the trigger now and ask questions later. You can't ever argue and win when you're especially when you're arguing opinion. So, win through your actions.
You just look at the flowers, Lizzie.
Sorry, I just had to.
That was such a screwed up scene. I mean, my wife and I were sitting there watching that, and it's just crazy. And Carol is, Carol's the lead, the prime example of, winning through actions and doing what's necessary. I mean, she didn't like doing that. She didn't want to, but she knew she had to. And I think that when you're trying to gain power in your own life, there are things that you aren't necessarily going to want to do. Now, telling someone to look at the flowers.
Well, think about how about when Shane had to shoot Otis when they were escaping with the ventilator, and there was no way they both were going to escape. So right. Shane was like, let me shoot this guy and leave him back for the as bait for the walkers or as winning through his action. He's shooting him in the kneecap so he can survive and so he can save Carl's life.
Kill or be killed, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, especially in the zombie apocalypse. Of course, we're
But that
not
case,
saying
he
that
wasn't,
that's not real life. It's TV, but
and Otis was with him. I mean, Otis, Shane didn't care because he didn't care about anyone, but Otis wasn't an enemy. It's just that Otis was slowing him down, and the only way they could have survived is for him to, sacrifice Otis.
right.
All right, how about law number 10, infection, avoid the unhappy and the unlucky. We see this when Rick finally meets back up with Morgan, and Morgan had gone, crazy and was living with him. He had all those bamboo poles to protect himself and all these traps, and he kept on writing clear all over the wall. And when Rick saw him, he didn't even recognize Rick. He was so crazy, and because he had lost his son, to his ex-wife. He was always hesitant to kill his ex-wife, even though she was a zombie. And when one day they were foraging for food, and he had gone down in a basement checking, and when he came back up, his son was standing there, and she was right in front. The zombie was right in front of the son, and the son hesitated because he was like, "That's my mom." And before you know it, the zombie was all over him, killed the son, and Morgan became crazy. So when Rick ran back into him, even though he had all these guns and stuff like that, he was like, "You know what? He's not going to be an asset to us. He's gonna endanger us." So he left him where he was.
Like in real life, I could think of several people that I had to cut loose that were just for that reason. A good friend is really going to be there for you in times of need. That's through rough times and through good and bad times. That's signs of a true friend. But there are people that are chronically unhappy or chronically unlucky. And oftentimes they're causing that for themselves. And you can't help people like that. They have to help themselves. And I think Morgan is a great example of that in the more recent episodes. I mean, he's kicking ass.
Yeah, he came back. But you know who else is a great friend is Carol. Because when those other people caught that flu and they became sick inside the prison, they were a threat. And no one wanted to take action. So what Carol did, she burned them. She burned them probably alive, but she took care of it so they wouldn't come back as walkers and, attack the inside of the safe zone inside the prison.
Well, I think in The Walking Dead, if someone is mortally injured or they're, or they're dying, there's no way out of that. It's almost an act of compassion to kill them, not just mercy. and then also stabbing them in the head. Which it's when we first started watching the show. I mean, so many years ago, all that is just it's just shocking to you. But then it almost becomes right, because almost comical at that point.
At first, we got used to seeing zombies getting their heads bashed in, and no one had really fought human on human until Rick and Shane, and then two guys in a bar. And then the next season, it just opened it up when they went to the prison and they met those prisoners who were not going to help them. Rick by then was just like done with it. He's like, you know what? If you try to throw me into a bunch of walkers and pretend like in an accident, and Rick just dropped a machete inside the guy's head, the guy Thomas. So, all bets are off in that kind of situation.
Law 11, learn to keep people dependent on you. I think we may have done our listeners a misjustice, because we should have told them right up from the beginning, hey, you know what? If you haven't watched The Walking Dead, or you have plans to, or you're behind in watching the episode, you're behind in the episodes, we're going to have some spoilers in here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
and we apologize.
Most of the stuff we're covering are in the first few seasons, but we do get a little bit into the current season 6. But yeah.
So if you're behind on your watching the episodes, just realize
spoiler alert.
Yeah, we might have some spoilers.
But yeah, the governor, right? The governor definitely knew how to keep his people of Woodbury, dependent on him, because they wouldn't survive without him. They needed someone with that hard edge, and him and his goons would make sure that they were protected inside their safe little, homes, and, had electricity, and were out drinking lemonade and, having barbecues and watching zombie fights.
Yeah. And in the more recent episodes in Alexandria, I don't know. I mean, the group really does not want people dependent on them. So they're trying to teach others how to defend themselves, trying to, open their eyes to the way the world is, because that group was so isolated. And I know we'll talk about that. And
well, they're going to be on board now because they weren't listening to Rick and did not want to carry guns inside the walls of their compound. Almost half of them just got murdered by people that climbed over the walls.
Yeah, Law 18. We'll jump ahead now. Use this opportunity. Do not build fortresses to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous, and that's absolutely true with the community of Alexandria in The Walking Dead. Is that they built the wall around them. They kept on with life just as they knew it before, but the world around them kept on changing, really for the worst, and they had no clue, I think, as far as how bad it was and what people needed to do in order to survive. And they brought that on themselves by creating a fortress and isolating themselves.
The same thing. That's what kind of saved Morgan. He kind of wised up and said, I can't survive on my by myself. It's not gonna, I need other people to rely on. And that's when he tracked down Rick and started following him all the way up to Virginia, to Alexandria.
Yep.
So I'm jumping back to law number 15: crush your enemy totally. Now this definitely in The Walking Dead, you have to crush your enemy totally, because if not, they're going to rise up and come back after you. We saw this at Terminus when Rick says, cross any of these people, kill them, don't hesitate. That's because they just tried to slaughter Rick and his friends like cattle, and Rick still didn't know yet. He didn't realize what was going on until they walked into basically a butcher's shop, and there was a bunch of torsos from humans hanging up on hooks, and they realized, hey, these people are cannibals. They're eating people, So he was like, these people don't get to live. If you find them, kill them. Have no mercy. And he also, when Gareth, who was the leader of the termites, or the Terminus people, when he first had Rick tied up, he said, hey, I realized you guys stashed, a bunch of weapons out in the woods. And Rick was like, you're right. I have some guns in there, and I have a machete with a red handle. That's the one I'm going to use to kill you. And, Gareth was like laughing it off, like, yeah, okay. But later on, sure enough, through the episodes, when they meet again and, the tides have turned, that's what Rick uses to kill him. And he crushed it. They kill all the termites without any hesitation.
Yeah, that's because they had barbecue.
Right. They ate their friend Bob.
They ate that foot. That was disgusting.
Bob's Burgers.
Okay.
How about law number 17, create an air of unpredictability? What more can you say about Rick Grimes? This guy will bite someone's throat out if you're threatening his kid. He picks up telephones and talks to imaginary people. And, even when you think you have him, you have him cornered and he has no weapons and no way out, he's still there like, you're screwing with the wrong people. He's just an insane, guy. And, he's definitely unpredictable.
Yeah. And I mean, I agree. I think, throughout my own experience, I think that being unpredictable in certain circumstances does make you more of a threat, and that people are not as willing to mess with you or to try to take advantage of you if they think of you as being unpredictable. That's really the best way to get out of a fight, is to kind of act unpredictably, do something that
crazy,
they wouldn't predict, catch them off guard, act a little crazy, and you might be able to get yourself out of a fight.
All right. How about law number 27? Create a cult. Now, there was not been a cult. I'm surprised we haven't seen an actual cult yet. I wouldn't doubt if we do.
Well, couldn't you call the wolves?
I guess you're kind of right. They have the W's inscribed in their heads. You might be right about that. And you definitely see it also with the Terminus people, where they have like all these sanctuaries of candles, basically almost like tributes to like a war, where it says, never again. And, they're
right.
Now they're just say, we'll 1 million served and we'll eat you as you pass through their drive-through. But the governor also uses that tactics. The governor knows that people need to blow off steam. So what's he do? He gets rock music and gets these zombies, and has like MMA fights, mixed martial art fights, and with like zombies chained up as on the perimeter. So like, if you get thrown out of the ring, you're going to get killed by a zombie. But people don't realize that, the governor doesn't want to kill his guys because his guys are the ones that are fighting. So they removed all the teeth so the walkers can't really truly bite them.
It's I think this brings up an interesting perspective. So we're talking about the laws of power and how to gain power and how that applies in Walking Dead. So absolutely, the governor was a leader and would want to create a cult-like following and entertain the crowds and so forth. But when I go back and I look at law number 20, do not commit to anyone, I have to think, this is a law that goes against the very nature of the group as it stands. I mean, that group is alive because they've worked as a team, they've had each other's backs, and they have committed to each other. They've become one family throughout this journey. So, I guess it says, it is the fool who always rushes to take sides. Do not commit to any side or cause but yourself. And by maintaining your independence, you become the master of others, playing people against one another and making them pursue you. It's that group mentality and the family mentality that has protected people. But you see this within the leaders. The governor is a great example of that. Garrett, they're looking out for themselves, and I guess that would be looking out for their family as well.
You're the town drunk who knocked over my fence and ripped up my yard. Nothing more.
Law 33, discover each man's thumbscrew. What Rick was doing there when he was meeting with the governor, he's trying to make him feel insignificant. Like, before all this started, you weren't a governor. You were the town drunk. You're just some guy that, meant nothing to me. So who the hell do you think you are now challenging me, Rick Grimes? So he was finding that thumbscrew, that he could twist on the governor to kind of get underneath his skin. And, the governor used this trick, too, because also when he had caught Glenn and Maggie and separated them. And so he basically was telling Maggie, he's like, look, I don't want to have to, I just want some information, but, we might have to send, maybe a hand or something from Glenn, and at the same time, he's in there pretending he's acting like he's going to rape Maggie, and Glenn is going crazy out of his mind thinking that, oh my God, this guy has raped her, when he never really did, but it was so close that, he thought so.
Yeah, man, let's face it. People's families are their thumbscrew. If anyone was threatening my wife or my children, I would gladly, not gladly, but I would kill if I had to. I would do anything I had to do to protect them. And I think most people are like that. Most parents are like that, especially with their children. Very protective.
Absolutely. I'll tell you some trivia based on what we're talking about right now. In the comic, it's a little different. Rick actually gets his hand cut off by the governor, right? That's never happened in the series. And the governor also rapes Michonne. And Michonne later on comes back and gets a hold of the governor, takes his eye. That's where his eye, takes his eye. Also takes one of his arms, cuts off one of his arms with her samurai sword, and also cuts off his dick. And then I think puts it in his mouth or something like that, but doesn't kill him. Novel. Yeah, so it was very graphic, and I guess they had no way to really put that into the TV show, but that was the original story.
Though, it reminds me of the movie Dodgeball, where it says, and I was watching the clips on that and said, nothing's really considered funny unless you get hit unless the person gets hit in the head or in the nuts. They're throwing the wrenches like to practice for the dodgeball,
right?
They're like, it's not funny unless they get hit in the head or in the nuts. And so you would think that maybe that was just cutting off his dick
well, now this leads into law.
hurt the ratings.
This leads into Law 23, where it's concentrate your forces. And in the comic book, the governor was really pissed off when he came back to the prison and he had a tank. And in the TV show, it was a little bit different. But the governor he found a new group of survivors and said, hey, if we're going to survive, we're going to need someplace safe. And you guys have a tank. So we're going to use that tank and go over to Rick Grimes' prison, and we're going to take it from him. We're going to give him the option to leave peacefully, and they're probably not going to. So we're going to destroy what we can and kill them all, and we'll rebuild it, and that will be our new home.
Yep. And, the governor also played the perfect courtier for Law 24.
Yes.
I mean, and so did the people of Terminus.
Yeah, I mean, because they're both kind of likable people in a way. The governor had a certain charm about him. That first, like you said, it was like, when he gives this big speech, like these are terrorists coming into our community. He made Rick and his group look like the bad guys. It reminded me almost of a presidential speech where, you're talking about the axis of evil. That's basically what he was doing. He was saying, hey, look, they came to us first. We didn't do anything. And they're attacking us. They're terrorists. We must stop them. So the good people that were in Woodbury were all behind the governor saying, yeah, we got to protect our home. Okay, whatever we have to do.
Yep. So I see several laws here that really do apply. As I look at 22, use the surrender tactic, transform weakness into power. I think that many different characters on the show, and Tommy, you probably are better at the character names than I am for exact scenes where this applied, but in many times people try to appear weak and to get people off of their guard, and then as soon as the person drops their guard, boom, they let them have it. It's
absolutely. I mean, I think Carol is a good example of this, where people, she was a battered spouse, so she, people saw her as kind of, oh, she's just a little quiet woman that is afraid to speak up, where she's actually become such a strong force. But she'll still betray that sometimes. Or even in the last episode we had with the wolves attacking, she disguised herself in the wolves' clothing, to make it look like she was one of them, and then snuck in and started killing them left and right to protect Alexandria.
Yeah. And, I think Carol is a great example of Law 23. Recreate yourself. I mean,
Yes.
She has recreated herself in really throughout the series. And she's put on the pretense that she's this, in Alexandria, she's put on this pretense that she's, Susie homemaker, and she's just this really quiet, timid woman, but everyone else knows different.
Right.
And she has she's just being very quiet about her strength. And I think it came to much people's surprise when she was out there killing the wolves.
That almost comes into law number 14, which is pose as a friend, work as a spy. Because Carol was kind of doing that. She's kind of like pretending to mingle with the Alexandrians to make sure that everything is on the up and up. But we also see that from another girl that, became very strong woman, and that was Beth. When Beth was at the hospital, she was like, you know what, I'm not going to get out of here unless I pretend to be a team member. And in that way I can sneak in and, start, playing ball and start finding out a way to escape.
Yeah, and that's true. And we talk about that a lot too on our regular episodes about playing the game. We all have to play the game to a certain extent. We, as adults, we don't always get what we want. And sometimes you have to kind of take one for the team in order to move forward towards a more long-term goal or the bigger picture goal that you're seeking.
One of the last laws, I think, if we want to wrap this up, and this is kind of a funny one, it's law number 40, despise the free lunch. And it's a good one. It's a good thing that, Rick and his crew never ate the free barbecue at Terminus, because essentially it was meat. It was people, So I think that's a good way to, wrap it up. And we also have to mention, since it also has to do with a swift kick in the ass, Judith.
You like that? Huh? Little ass kicker?
I just had to put that in there for the little ass kicker. That's Judith.
You know,
That's Rick's daughter.
Besides the the barbecue and the cannibalism and it's despising the free lunch, you really see this amongst every member of that team. They have to be able to hold their own. They're much more powerful together as a team and working as a team, but they're only as strong as their weakest link. And if you notice throughout the series, the weak links always, they get what's coming to them. I mean, they are not willing to take a stand. They're not willing to recreate themselves and do what must be done in order to survive. And that, that hurts them. Master of the art of timing. And I know we need to wrap this up, but you see this also time and time again throughout how the like Shane and Otis, that was a timing issue. You do what's best for
personal here, but you're going to have to step back.
Yeah.
So this is really, I mean, yeah, it's fiction, but stuff like this has happened in real life. And, I was reading an example that happened back in 1851, where the state of California paid out close to $1 million for the killing of Indians. And they killed 90% of the population of Indians in California because they were having the gold rush, and they had all these miners out there. And they told them, if you bring a scalp of an Indian, you get 25 cents. If you bring a head of an Indian, you get $5. $5 back then, it was a lot of money. So these people,
$1 million
men
back then is a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's a lot of money now, but you said 1851?
Yeah, 1851. But they killed 90% of the Indian population, and they didn't think anything about it. It was just like, they're savages, no big deal. And that's how some of these people look at the other, they're just like determinist people. They treated them, they were like, it's just time to make the donuts. They just had to eat. It was nothing personal.
Yes.
All right, so I think that about wraps it up. We'd like you to go to A Swift Kick in the Ass, check out, action plans for our different episodes. And also, if you can, swing by a Swift Facebook.com with A Swift Kick in the Ass and give us a like. That'll help us out. And if you really, really want to do something for us and help us out, go subscribe to the podcast. It's real easy to do. You push one button and it helps us. It helps us grow the audience and be able to share this with, other people. So thanks for listening. I'm Tom. Peace.
This is John. Talk to you later.